My name is Marta Indulska. I'm a Professor of Information Systems in the Business School here at the University of Queensland and also the Research Director at CIRES. And it is my absolute pleasure today to introduce Professor Tim Kastelle, who is the Director at the Andrew Liveris Academy for Innovation and Leadership. I can't think of a more apt role for Tim. Tim is an international thought leader in innovation management. He's got a long, extensive track record of academic contributions to the field. What makes Tim really special also is that he excels at research translation, and he's been able to turn his research into practice, and he's helped government and industry uplift their innovation by developing innovation programs. Now, it's very special for me to introduce Tim because Tim and I have actually worked together for a long time, back when he was in the business school. I don't want to age us, Tim, but that's probably about 20 years worth of working together. So I know Tim pretty well. I can tell you he's a lovely person. He's a very supportive colleague. He's a cat person. And I can tell you he has a blog. Yeah. I'm not the only person who knows that he has a blog because that blog is actually an internationally renowned blog on innovation. And if you dig deep on that blog, which is timkastelle.org, by the way, you will find one of my favorite posts that shows Tim, much younger Tim, sorry Tim, you have aged a little bit since then, as a radio DJ. And he describes that role as something that has helped him to shift from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset, which of course is something that is central to innovation. So Tim lives and breathes innovation, and is also very passionate about enabling the entrepreneurial spirit in colleagues and in students. So I will step aside, Tim, and I will let you do your job, and we very much look forward to it.
Thanks, Marta. So I know we've got the really boring talk title in the agenda, but this is the actual title for the talk today. And I'll explain why we have this title in a little bit. But I want to talk to you today about how we take the work that we do as researchers and turn it into something that has an impact out in the world, right? And I think that this isn't universally true, right? But most people that I know that do research because there's something in the world that they want to see different. Right? So I know some people are working on things like circular economy, right? There's a change in the world that we want to see if we're working on the circular economy right now, right? We want to be more sustainable. We want less waste. We want a better outcome and future for everyone, right? So there's that set of outcomes that we're aiming for by doing that research, right? And the thing that I want to focus on today in the time that I've got with you is to just think about how do we actually see that change in the world that we're aiming for. Because it doesn't usually happen by just publishing a bunch of papers, right? You have to take some further steps to do that. And Marta mentioned some of the work that I've done with business and government. I've done a lot of work with CSIRO, which I'll mention in a little bit. All of that has been designed to, so the change in the world that I want to see is I want more innovation happening in Southeast Queensland, in Australia, and in the world, because that's how we make change, mostly for the better. It's not universally good, right? But if we want change for the better, we have to do things differently, right? And so innovation has to be central to doing that. And so I want to do my part to help people around here be more innovative. And so to do that, I'll tell you a little bit about my story and how I've ended up in this spot. First, I'm sure that you've done this previously, but I do want to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting. That here's the Yagara and Turrbal people. They've held custodianship of this land for 60,000 plus years, and in doing so have adapted to several ice ages, multiple instances of massive climate change and circumstantial change, and have innovated throughout that period of time to be able to maintain that custodianship for 60,000 years. As a consequence of that, I want to pay our respects to their ancestors and descendants, who continue to hold connection to country here. All right, so I want to start by a little bit about my career. So this ARC Discovery grant proposal went in the year after my PhD was granted. So I was really lucky to put in my PhD. I was a PhD student here at UQ at the business school. My wife's in the School of Psychology. That's why we moved here in the first place. I didn't have a lot of room to move in terms of finding a spot. So I was really grateful when the business school gave me a spot. So we put in this Discovery grant proposal, and it was successful. So we had a Discovery grant. And we were looking at how innovation networks had an impact on knowledge management and change within project-based firms, which is primarily engineering and mining companies. And on the right, you can see that by the standard metrics of academic success, this was a very successful grant, right? So we had 4 different industry partners that we worked with. We had 2 PhD students that came through and did work with those industry partners and have subsequently had exceptionally good careers in academia. We had 14 publications that came out of it. Even though this was 15 years ago, we still occasionally get another one that pops out of it. The 2 junior researchers on this grant, John and I, each got promoted twice as a consequence of all this. So, right, all of that looked great. But there was a problem. The problem was I'd been in industry for 15 years before I did my PhD. I'm counting the time at the radio station because I was learning a lot about how things worked at that point in time. But for 15 years, I was managing organizations. And when I made the decision to go into academia, the thing that I wanted to focus on was doing things that would have an impact on the way organizations operate, right? So that was my metric. So all this was great, but my metric was, are things actually happening as a consequence of that work that we're doing, right? So this was the academic output from all of this. This was the real world impact that we had from that really good string of research. Right, so one water committee at one mine in WA changed the membership that they had on the water committee. That was actually really important. Right, so that was an impactful change, but the actual amount of change that was coming out of that stream of research was really very small, and I thought that was pretty discouraging. And so I'll tell you how that shifted in a little bit. But what this reminded me of was actually the last job that I had before I went into academia. So the last job that I had was with a software startup. And the things so keep in mind, the story that I'm going to tell you right now is 25 years old. So the technical elements of this are going to sound like kindergarten things to those of you in the room that are doing, research in this space. So just keep that in mind as I talk about it. But that CD, so this is dating it already, but that CD that's in my hand there cost $600,000 to make, right? Because it was the first one. And so there was R&D time, there was development time, there was working out how to build it. And what that contained was a software server that you could build e-commerce platforms on top of, right? And in 2000, 2002, this was a really important thing to have. And our idea was that this was going to compete with Microsoft Office. So the founder, who did all the programming, looked at it and he said, well, sorry, not Office, Server, Microsoft Server. He said, Microsoft Server, businesses are paying $10,000 in installation to put that in. The software itself sucks. I can make something better. And then we can charge $10,000 in installation with our better product. So that was his plan. And so he hired me. I was the first person that wasn't a founder hired in. I was the third person in the startup. And we came in and just started trying, and so my job was to sell this. And so I started talking to people that were building databases. And the first thing that I learned really quickly was that this is enterprise software. If you're selling enterprise software and you're trying to replace something from Microsoft, large corporations are not going to buy replacement software from 3 guys in a garage in Milton. So that turned out to be our first problem. And so we said, okay, so that's not going to work. And so then I said, well, who else is building e-commerce websites right now, and it was mostly web developers. So if you were a small store in the early 2000s, you would go to a web developer, you'd say, I need a website. They would charge you anywhere from, I turned it off deliberately.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. They would charge you anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000. I just got sick of seeing myself. They charge you, $20,000 to $50,000 to build a website, and then you'd have a website. And so I started talking to them, and I said, well, what are you using as the server on the back end? And they said, well, we're using MySQL. And so I'd say, well, we've got this software, it does some cool stuff. Would you give it a try? And most of them would trial it, and then I would do follow-up calls, and no one would take the call. And the thing that I had learned with that group was that MySQL, our competitor in that space, was shareware. It was free. It was like Apache and everything else. And so the idea that we would give them something that had possibly marginally better features to replace their thing that was free and try to charge the Microsoft price at that, none of it added up. And so it didn't work, and so we failed. There was one little thing in the middle of all this. So the lead programmer, to this day, I don't know how he did it. I'm not sure that he knows how he did it, but he had figured out a way to send one SQL query to two different databases and return one merged answer, right? And at the time, major database transition from a legacy program to a new one was a major, major problem. Right, the RMIT in something like 1998 tried to change to a new student management piece of software. It crashed so badly that if they'd been a commercial operation, they'd have been out of business. Right, because it was hard to transition from one database to another. And so with one SQL query to two databases and one returned answer, the thing that opened up is you could actually send the query out, get the return. You could leave the legacy database in place instead of trying to transfer all the data into the new database, which is the thing that was crashing everything. So we actually could have found an application for that piece of software. When I found that as an opportunity, I went to John and I said, we could do this. I don't think we're going to make it as a server for websites, but here's an option. And he said, no, that's not what I built it for. And he made the decision that he would rather go out of business than try something different, right? So I'm going to return to that story, but I just wanted to tell you that because the fundamental bit underneath, right, the technological innovation that he came up with was really good, right? So if you think about it from an academic standpoint, if he had done that as a PhD project, he could have gotten published because he did something no one had done before. Right? He could have done a whole set of things. But then if you look at it and say, well, did it affect any kind of measurable change in the world? The answer to that is no. Right? And so the impact of the startup was even less than the impact of that first research program that I ran. So those are the two things that framed this next round of work that I ended up doing. And so that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time that we've got this afternoon. So I've mentioned this phrase a couple of times, and Marta talked about it in the introduction. I just want to give you a definition of innovation so that we're all on the same page with this, because it's one of those phrases that everyone thinks they understand, but right, everyone has a different meaning in their head. So for me, innovation is something that has three parts. Right? So the first part is a new idea. And everyone gets that part, that innovation has something to do with new ideas. If you go to Amazon and you say, show me every book that has innovation in the title, you get over 90,000 responses to that search. And if you start scrolling through, it will take you only a minute or two to realize that every single one of those books has a light bulb on the cover. Which drives me nuts, right? Because the implication of that is that innovation is just about having an idea. It's the light bulb. You say, aha, I've had the idea, now everything's fine, right? And that's not true. And so, my rule on innovation is no light bulbs. Every time I've done online courses, learning designers get really excited because, oh, it's light bulb everything. And then I lay down the law, there's no light bulbs, and then they get really mad. Right? So I use the lightning bolt because the flash of inspiration is still important, but it's not sufficient. Right? So you need to have the new idea, but just as importantly, you have to be able to build it. Right? So you have to make that idea real. So I use the monkey wrench to symbolize that for two reasons. One is that that is the hard work part of it. The other thing is that the monkey wrench symbolically is also the wrench in the system. And so one of the things with doing new things, implementing new ideas, is that it requires people to change, right? They have to change behavior to adopt a new idea. And so that throws a wrench in the system and can be a big obstacle. So that's the second part, right? So new idea made real. The most frustrated people in the world are people that have had a new idea, they've made it real, and no one cares, right? That's where we were in my software startup, right? We had a product, John had built it, we had it real, I could get people to download it and try it. No one wanted to talk to me, right? And the reason no one wanted to talk to me was because we were missing the third part, which was that new idea created no new value for people. So the third part of innovation is that new idea that you have built and delivered to someone has to help them achieve some goal that they have, right? It has to make them happier, healthier. Yeah, more beautiful. Right? There's a whole set of things, right, that we can help people achieve, and we need to do one of those things. And so if we don't have all three of those parts, then we don't have innovation. So innovation is executing new ideas to create value. The problem that we get is that, like my startup, most new ideas fail to create value, right? So this is my handmade Excel graph. But this data is terrifying. So if you're a large existing company and you launch a new product, you have production, you have a brand, you have routes to market, you have people that you work with, you have people that know who you are, people have already bought your things. If you launch a new product as an existing company, the average success rate is about 18%. Right? So 80% of new product ideas fail. Startups, even worse. Right? So the percentage of startups that are around 2 years after they're founded is about 9%. And then this is the one that's relevant for research. So people say, well, maybe researchers are better. So we say, okay, patents. If you take out a patent, you can't get a patent unless you can prove that your idea is new and you can prove that it works. Right? It's one of the primary metrics of innovation success in universities and R&D-based corporations. Percentage of patents that are actually in use in the world, I've been generous here and said 2%, it's actually 1.6%. So we're even worse with research. So all those red lines are new ideas that someone has had, they've built it, they've launched it, it's failed. If we look at it and say, why is that the case? The thing that we're running into is that most of those things are not creating value for stakeholders. Right? And so the thing that I want to emphasize for everyone is that, right, it's really important that you do good research. You also have to have some picture of what value is that research going to create for people, because that's how you have whatever impact it is on the world that you're trying to have. Right. So Marta and I come from a business school. The way you can tell someone is trying to teach you management is they'll show you a 2x2 matrix. The way that you can tell someone is trying to teach you about innovation is they'll show you a funnel. So here's my version of the funnel. The funnel is you start with lots and lots of good ideas. You figure out a way to narrow them down. You launch a few of them. And then you get whatever good outcome you're trying to get from the innovation. It can be growth, right? It can be economic thriving. It can be a more sustainable economy. But one way or another, we start with way more ideas than we have time or resources to implement. And we come down to, here's the outcome that we're trying to achieve with that innovation. And the number of steps that we go through, if you say what goes into that funnel, it normally starts with we have our new idea. And so we start with the idea and we build it. And then the second step is you say, okay, what's the business model that goes with this? Right? That's the thing that we were missing in my software startup. So what's the business model and can we validate that? And then we launch it, right? And that's what gets you onto that graph that I just showed you where most of these things launch and then fail. But a handful will get some traction, they'll take off, and they'll scale and have impact out in the world. So if you think about this going through the funnel, right, the really fat part is people working on ideas. The next step down is people that are validating business models. Third step down is the number of people that launch that as a thing. And the fourth thing is an even smaller number actually get to scale and have an impact. And so if we look at it and we say, well, why are all these ideas failing? The really common thread, and it doesn't matter if you're an existing company, a startup, or a researcher, the thing that we consistently do is we skip that second step. So the problem that we run into is everyone wants to go from, I have this great idea, to launch. Right? That's why those ideas are failing. And the thing, and I've been working on this for 20 years. I can't figure out why. Right? Why? We understand that if we're debugging a piece of software that we're working on, the first thing that we try almost certainly never works. Right? We have to hack around with it for hours until we get to the point that we've sorted it out. If you're doing lab research, we know that it takes a bunch of time to work out the process and the procedure and to get all of your tubes cleaned correctly and to get right. We have to hack around with that. Somehow people want to believe that launching a new idea so that it creates value for people is somehow simpler than any other idea that we deal with, that we can just have the idea, launch it, boom, everything works. And that's not the way it happens. And so we skip that second step. So my whole stream of research, engagement, everything else has been, what do we put in the second step to solve this problem? So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit now going forward. So that's the missing part, right, is how do we validate the value that we're going to create for stakeholders? And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about kind of 3 different ideas that might help us with this, right? The main thing is when we're launching an idea, right, whether you're doing it as a startup or as a business, if you're working with a tech transfer office, doesn't matter how you're doing it. If you're trying to take that idea and get it out into the world, we want to stage our investments based on learning, right? Which makes sense when I say it like that, but in practice it's hard. So the idea here is, how do we test if we're on the right track with something? And what it requires us to do is to go through this kind of process. So people that have done research on creativity have consistently come up with this as a process for creative thought. And the idea with this is that anytime you do something that's creative, you have some period of time when you do divergent thinking, right? So that's when you're generating the range of possibilities that you might look at. And then you have a middle period where you test out a bunch of those different ideas and figure out which ones are most likely to work, which ones aren't going to work. And then you converge on, this is what it should look like. Right? If you reflect on what's going on in your research, right, everyone that has a poster up on the wall has gone through some version of this process. Right? You started out with, here's the range of questions I can look at. You narrowed it down. You ran some tests. You built something. You did some work. It worked. And then you say, okay, that's what it looks like. And now we'll write it up and we're away. You go through that process all the time. The thing that that middle missing step is that it's this middle bit. That's where we do the testing, the playing, the validation. And the reason that people don't like that is that that middle bit is chaos. Right? In the middle bit, we don't know what's going to work. We have this range of possibilities. We don't know what's going to work. We have to test it. Right? And that's threatening for a bunch of people for a bunch of different reasons. One of them is that it's uncertain, and a lot of people don't like uncertainty. The second thing is that when you're in that period of time, you can feel like you don't know what's happening, right? And some people will absorb that as a message about their capabilities, right? Whoever has been doing research and had something not work, and you said to yourself, are you stupid? Right? I have, maybe you haven't, but most of us, I think, probably have gone through this period where we're in that middle bit, we're testing things, trying things around, they're not working, and we adapt, we personalize it to ourselves. Right? So that's the process that we have to go through, and we have to deliberately work out ways to do this. And one of the things that I say to people that do research is that we understand how to do this for the research side of things. we have to go through a similar process for the impact side of things. All right, so there's a couple things that we can do. One is we can work out, well, what is the business model for this idea? Right, this is the business model canvas. It came from a guy named Alex Osterwalder. This was actually his PhD research, which he published in 2006, I think, or 2008, roughly. So he came up and he said, can we come up with a consistent set of factors that determine whether or not business ideas are more or less successful? And he did a bunch of research and he came up with this as a model. There's many different models of business model, but this is the one that has gotten the most traction and is the most successful. And so this is what it looks like. So for here, we're looking at things like customer segments and value propositions. That's kind of where everything starts. So if we go back to my software example, right, our original customer segment was large businesses running enterprise software to build e-commerce websites, right? And we thought that the value proposition that they were looking for was better feature set, right? When in fact, what they're looking for in that segment of the market is reliability, uptime, tech support, a whole, like, actual feature set, even how well it works comes in at like 6th or 7th on their priority list. And so walking in the door saying, hey, we've got this thing with better features, did us no good. It's the wrong value proposition for that market segment. Right, the thing that I mentioned with the database unification, there were people at the time that we could have gone and pitched that to who had that specific problem, but we didn't find them, and so that never got traction. But the idea with this is that you build a business model where you have a coherent set of activities and actions that allow you to then take the idea out into the world. Now, if you're working on a PhD, even if you're an established researcher, this might sound abstract or off topic or like it's a distraction. The argument that I will make with you is that you have to at least give this some thought, and you have to have some understanding of who needs my research, right? And if you do build that understanding, two things will happen. The first is that it will change the work that you're doing because you'll adapt it to what people out in the world needs. That increases the chances that you'll have impact with it. The second thing that happens if you start thinking about who needs my research is that you'll engage with people that have the problems that you think you know about, and you'll learn things about what's going on, which again will improve your research. Right? It doesn't necessarily improve the publication, but it absolutely changes the probability that you're going to have impact with that idea. So you don't have to build a business around it, but it's a useful exercise for just understanding what do people need, right? And what should I be working on to have the biggest chance of impact that I can, right? And the dilemma that we're trying to solve here is that if you go down a route, a research route that isn't productive, you can waste 4 or 5 years of your career. Right? You can come out of it and say, I just did 4 years on this research stream. I've got my publications, that's great. Maybe I got my promotion, that's fine. Have I made a dent on the problem that I actually set out to solve? Maybe, maybe not. Right? So that's what we're trying to actually solve for here. The challenge that we get is that for a business model, like everyone has a business model in their head when they want to launch something. So all those people in the red bars that had new ideas that launched and failed, they have a business model picture in their head, whether they've tested it explicitly or not. The dilemma that we have is that your first pass through, everything's a guess. There's empirical research on this when people are building a startup or trying to launch something new, or if they're researchers trying to develop a business model to support their research. The chances of getting any one of those guesses right is about 30%. Right? And so if you say, okay, there's 9 boxes, we have a 30% chance of being right in each one, and you multiply 30 to 9th, say that's our odds of being completely correct on everything right from the start. That's a very, very small number. Right? And so our question then is, well, how do we make that number bigger? How do we improve the chances that we have all of this right? And the number one thing that we need to do is we need to go and talk to people. So this quote actually popped up on my Twitter feed a few years ago. It was really striking to me because it rings true, right? So conversations are the smallest units of change. I've never been able to find the original source of the quote. Google doesn't help. ChatGPT doesn't help. The answers via ChatGPT are phantoms. So they come back with, it seems like the kind of thing that Kim Scott would have said, but that's not right. So anyway, I can't find the quote. May have been just whoever wrote that tweet. But anyway, I think this is right? So how do we actually figure out if we're on the right track? We have to go out and talk to people, right? And the dilemma with this is that if you're in this room, the chance that you're an introvert is really high. So going and talking to people might not be fun. It might not be high on your list of, I really, you can get to the point and you say, no, actually, I'd rather read 5 more articles than go talk to a bunch of people. Or something even worse than reading 5 more articles, right? But we have to work out a way to push through this and actually go out and have conversations to understand what people are grappling with. And this is where the name of the talk came from. So the whole thing here is that we have this model of the world in our heads. The model of the world in our heads is often wrong, right? And so this is an example of me being very wrong a few years ago. This is the new cat bed. My wife and I saw this on the internet. We said, that would be a lovely place for our cats to hang out. So we bought it. It looked like that for 12 months until we gave it away to a friend. They spent all their time in the box. What that proved to me is that I would be a lousy cat, right? Because in my head, the big fish looked great. Obviously, it's clearly deficient if you're a cat, but I don't know why, right? And so it doesn't matter what you're building. You think you know what people need, and we don't, right? So ever since this experience, I just constantly remind myself I'm not a cat. Maybe I should test with the cats first to figure out if my hypothesis there is on the right track. And I do the same thing with ideas that we're trying to launch. The way to do this is that we need to build empathy with people, right? And that's one of the ways to get around this as an introvert, because building empathy is actually the kind of conversation that introverts like, because it tends to be relatively deep, it's meaningful, you make a connection with someone, it's not small talk, it's not superficial, right? And so you can get some good outcomes from trying to learn about what's going on with people. This is a quote from a book called Practical Empathy by Indy Young. And I really like it. I won't read the whole thing, but what it basically says is that people make a mistake. They want to act with empathy, but they do that without having first built empathy, right? And so the idea there is that here, I wanted to give my cats something I thought they wanted, but I didn't yet understand what it is that they actually needed, right? And so I wanted to act with empathy. I didn't have it built yet. So you actually have to go through that process of building empathy with people, which you do through conversation. So when we run programs with researchers, the thing that we actually do is we get them to go out in the field and talk with anywhere from 50 to 100 stakeholders. Right? That can be people that would use their research. It can be government officials that would legislate it. It can be a whole range of things. But we get them to talk to the people that actually need their work so that we can understand a way that will deliver them things that are usable. Right? If anyone does any work relating to policy, this is really important, because if you're a policymaker, what you need from researchers is very different than what we think policymakers should be paying attention to. And so we have to understand the format, the way that you build it, all the rest of that. So empathy is really important. Next thing is that when we're doing research-based impact work, value propositions get very confused. Right? So this is a medical device. This is designed to treat emphysema. We had at iLab here at UQ a few years ago a really good founder team who's the original founder His little sister had emphysema. He didn't like the devices that were in place to help her get better with it. And so he said, I can build something better. I'm an engineer. And so he built something better. The device went nowhere. And the reason is the question on the right. So if you're building a medical device, how many value propositions do you actually have to get a medical device to successfully work? Right? And the answer is a much bigger number than you expect it to be. Right? So his whole thing was, okay, if I give it to my sister, will it help her breathe more effectively? So you have to have a value proposition for the patient. It has to address the presenting symptoms. But for a medical device, how do you get a hold of them? Usually, it's a doctor that says, you have this problem, you should use this thing. So you have to have a value proposition for the doctors. In Australia and most civilized countries in the world, someone other than one of those two people is paying. So whoever's going to pay for the purchase and use of that device also has to believe it's going to work. Because it has a medical outcome, in most places, there's regulatory hurdles that you have to get over. So you have to have a value proposition for regulators. There's often some kind of government constraint, and so you can have a fifth value proposition. And then the last thing is, for a medical device, most of the people that invent them are not the people that build them. And so you have to be able to go to a manufacturer and say, this many people have emphysema, this many people are treated for it every single year, this many people are in an age range that would buy a device that looks like that. Does that give you sufficient volume to make it worthwhile to manufacture it? So this is actually a six-sided market. And you have to successfully launch that device, you need to meet the needs of all six of those sides. And most of the things that we're going to be working on in an academic space have multi-sided markets. And so you have to have some understanding of what's going on with those different set of stakeholders. So this is an example from one of the research teams that I worked with via CSIRO. So it was a team that was working on transgenic mice. Some of you in the room might not be native to Australia. And if you're not, at some point, just do a Google search and look up Australia mouse plagues. The results are terrifying. Right? If you don't like rodents, they're absolutely terrifying. So about once every 15 to 20 years, in the center of Australia, there's a mouse plague. Right? We have overwhelming numbers of mice. They run through properties, they destroy crops, they destroy buildings, sometimes they injure people, like all kinds of bad stuff happens. And so, and the economic cost of each mouse plague is in the billions of dollars. So it's a bad thing. So the researchers said, okay, we can make genetically modified mice. We can drop them into those populations that have the explosions. That will dampen the peak level of population, and we can eliminate mouse plagues completely. So that was their research. And so they came into this program that we were running. It was about a 12-week, 8-week program at the time. And they said, this is what we're doing. And I said, okay, what's your business model? And they said, we're gonna once the science works, we're gonna sell our transgenic mice to farmers. They can release the mice on their farms, and then they won't have to worry about mouse plagues. And I said, okay, let's test that. And so over the next 8 weeks, they spoke to, I think it was 94 different stakeholders. They came back at the end of it, we had a lessons learned session, and this is what they reported back. They said, turns out, it's not as simple as we thought. Right? So the thing that they learned in all of those conversations, they learned a few things. The first one was, farmers aren't that worried about mouse plagues for two reasons. One, they're very traumatic when they happen, but most people that were running farms are young enough that they hadn't experienced the last mouse plague. If it was a family farm, it was their parents that experienced it. And so it wasn't a real problem to them. The second thing that they ran into is that if they had experienced a mouse plague, the feedback that they got was, yes, it was really bad, but insurance covered everything. So in both of those instances, farmers aren't going to pay for something that's going to address mouse plagues. And so then they said, okay, well, what happens if we try to get it legislated? Sorry. Thanks. So what if we get it legislated? So they went and they figured out which federal departments have to approve this as an idea. Turns out there's 3. You can date this research by which ministers were involved in the portfolios at the time. Right, but basically they said, well, we had to get 3 different departments to agree to support our work. The odds of getting that lined up are really small, so that's not going to work. And then they said, well, maybe we should talk to some of the peak bodies like AgForce or the regional development centers and things like that, regional development corporations. And there they got some traction. And so then they were starting to think, well, maybe that's the way to go. And then they came back and they said, but the really big thing that we learned was this bit. So it turns out, now, keep in mind, these are people that are doing research on genetically modified animals. They came back and they said, there's a lot of people out in the general public that don't like genetically modified anything. So they're gonna resist any research that we do, and we need to have a strategy for dealing with that. Now, if that's your primary research area and you want this work to have impact, you must understand this part of this map. Right, so if nothing else came out of that 8 weeks that they spent doing this, having that understanding that they didn't have previously is transformative, right? Because it means they have to have a better understanding of how to get that idea actually out in the world, right? And the dilemma there is that they could get the genetic modification to work, they could publish their papers on it, they could then hand it to their their tech transfer office, say, go take this out into the world. They would say, okay, well, go try, and nothing would come of it. And then they'd be 5 years down the road in their career, and they'd say, what are we going to do now? I guess we had some nice publications, but we didn't actually make the rural economy better, which is what was driving them. So you need to have these conversations to understand what's going on. You need to understand who your stakeholders are for the work. Anyone doing work in AI has to understand right now the anti-AI movement. Right? If we're doing circular economy work, we have to understand what's pushing back against that. We have to understand what does this broader ecosystem of interests and motivations look like in the area that's relevant to us. Right? And it might sound like a luxury, but if we actually want impact, these are the kinds of things we have to be thinking about. So one last little kind of metaphor story. So NASA in 1968 or 69 put a man on the moon. I should know, but I was really tiny at the time. So they put a man on the moon. Ever since they did that, they had people coming up to them saying, I've got this great idea for a rocket. If you give me $1 million, you can have my great idea. And it happened so often that they got sick of it. And they said, okay, we're going to make this thing that we call the Technology Readiness Level Index. And so they said to that, so they used this for everyone that came in and said, I've got a great idea for a rocket. And they said, that's great, but that just puts you here, right? You have basic principles that you've observed and you've reported, that's a great idea. You have to go through these other 8 steps. If you go through these other 8 steps, then we have something we can actually put on a rocket. And they send people back out and they say, go start working on this. If you get up to about TRL 6, then come back to us. And not only will we give you probably way more than $1 million, but we'll also help you get the rest of the way so that your great idea does in fact end up on a rocket. So this is a way to measure the technological maturity of complex ideas that you might be working on. Right? And so most R&D-based organizations use some version of this. Steve Blank is one of the people that has helped figure out how to make the launching of new ideas more effective. And he said, well, look, we can do the same thing for business models. Right? So I showed you the business model canvas, right? So a lot of times if you're working with researchers or people running startups, you say, okay, you need a business model. Filling in the canvas for the first time is trivial. Right? But then it gets you into the spot where 30% chance of any one box being correct. So complete first pass canvas is basically IRL1, and similarly, we have to go through this process of testing the rest of our assumptions. Once we've done that sufficiently, then we can get to a point where we say, yep, we have a validated business model, and now we can take that forward. Right? And again, as a researcher, you might not take it forward yourself. Right? You might not want to be a company founder. But if you have this understanding of what business model goes with the idea that I'm working on, the odds that it's going to get out in the world and be successful are much, much higher than they would be otherwise if we just do the work and then throw it over the wall. The way that we normally do this is we work on the tech first, and then we do the business side of it. Right? So the software startup was exactly that. John built his software, and then he brought me in and said, all right, just go find the people that need it. That part should be simple. And then we failed. Same thing happens with tech transfer offices. If you're inside of a university, if you're within UQ, you'll end up talking to UniQuest at some point if you have a really good idea. You do the work first, you hand it to them, and then we pray. And so that's the normal way that we do it. The argument that I'm making here is that we don't want to do that. What we actually want to do is we want to do some work on at least market evaluation in parallel to the technical work that we're doing, because it shapes the work that we then subsequently do. It also greatly increases the chance that we'll have impact with that work. So this is an example of this is what happens if you do that. If you follow a good, clean process for working your way through those investment readiness levels and develop a validated business model, the companies that do that can get their new product success rate up from 18% to 40 to 50%. So right, we're more than double there. If you're trying to build a startup, a software startup or a tech startup of any sort, and you go through a program that uses this kind of process, your success rate goes from 9% to, again, 20 to 30%. The work that I did with CSIRO with patents and scientists, that base rate was about 1.6%. We got over 20% of the teams that went through the program with us actually then ended up with something in the world that people were using. Right? So if you go through a process of working out who are the stakeholders, what do they need, how do I meet those needs, the chances of having impact with our ideas goes up radically. I've got a few other slides that talk about that program, but I think this is actually a good place to stop it. So we'll just go through to that. Just want to remind you again, once again, we're not cats. We actually need to figure out who are the groups that we care about, what is it that they need, can we understand what's going on with them such that we can deliver value in a way that's going to be useful for them. So that's my fundamental message with all this, and that's officially it. That's where the blog is if you're somehow interested in that. So thanks. So I think we do have some time for questions if anyone has any, and it can range from this was nuts to a tactical one. Yep.
It seems like you have a lot of experience sort of interacting with researchers that transition to like the business side of things. Just sort of speaking broadly, what are your experiences with the sort of aptitude or sort of attitude of researchers who are transitioning to business, and the fact that I'm thinking most researchers probably like contrary to the business mindset. Yeah. So if you're if you're part of a program where you're trying to bring people across,
yeah,
and sort of get them to start thinking like this, is that change really that easy, or what's your experience?
So it's a great question. So there's a couple things with it. One is I have a PhD student right now that's studying that transition point for researchers, and what happens if you hire in a CEO. So there's a few different routes that you can take in that instance. One is that kind of the normal tech transfer route for universities is a license. So if you build something and it's going to work and it's successful, take out a patent. If you're at UQ, you go to UniQuest. The thing that they will try to do with whatever it is that you've built is they'll try to take out a license. The problem with a license is that that's a corporation taking out an option on the work that you've done. They may or may not care about it. And often people will take out a license and you get no return and consequently no impact. So if you do work like this, and your goal is to just hand it off to a tech transfer officer, what it actually means is that you have a better picture of what that corporate partner should look like, and you'll get better outcomes from doing that, even if you never step foot outside of your lab or wherever it is that you're doing your work, right? So it gets better outcomes in that respect. With that CSIRO program that we built, the target was specifically built for spin-outs, so tech-based spin-outs with the researcher going along. There's advantages and disadvantages to that. If you have the core research team that goes out with a startup, the odds of success actually go up. But like you pointed out, not a lot of people necessarily want to do that. So one thing that you can do is just work out, is this particular idea important enough that I'm willing to step out for a little bit? At an institutional level, we need to get a lot better at giving people things like unpaid leave to pursue ideas for 2 years to see if it's going to work and then come back. There's other options where you say, look, it's best as a startup. Let's figure out a way to license it to a dropped-in business team. So there's different options. I didn't want to imply that the only route is to go out yourself with the tech, right? But you kind of need to work out what's best for the idea that I'm working on myself. Does that address it? It kind of is, but like you say, not everyone wants to. So that's the dilemma. But it really depends. You know, if you've got, you know, I've done a lot of work with researchers that are doing ecological research because they want to save the Great Barrier Reef. You know, and the thing for them is that yes, the work that they're doing in the lab is important. Getting that work into practice is possibly more important, right? And so for them, they're looking at it saying, well, yeah, I'm happy in the lab, but I've got to go this way, right? The whole thing with a process like this is you at least have a better understanding what the parameters are, what the options are, right? But the main thing, if you take nothing else away from today, I do just want to make the point that just having a really good idea, writing the paper and publishing it, we tell ourselves a whole set of fantastic stories about how some magical person is out reading the academic literature. They will take the good idea and figure out a way to make it real. That never happens. So we have to have some strategy for actually getting the idea outside. Yes.
You said if you are not in the right track, if you are not going out and talk with other people, you may waste your time for 2 years of research. So we can't talk with everybody, and we can't understand what happens outside, how we understand that we are in the right track. And for example, someone else is not doing the same as what we are thinking that it's a new innovation.
Yeah.
And it's go out before we publish it.
Yeah. So there's two parts to that question, right? And so it's a really good one. So one is, how do we know we're on the right track? The second one is, how do we know what other people are working on, right? I'll take the second part first. So the second part first, one way to know what other people are working on is go to things like this, because you get information. Conferences are really important for that as well. We have an interesting situation with science where we think about priority, right? And so if you're working on the same problem in the same way, publishing first is important. Right, and you know, the classic example of that goes back to Charles Darwin, Alfred Russel Wallace, and evolution by natural selection. They took very different routes to get to that idea. Wallace wrote a paper. Darwin had been working on it for 25 years. His friends helped him jiggle things around. So he wrote a paper. They were published simultaneously. And then we talk about both of them. Because Darwin had it more worked out, he got more credit for it because he kept working on it, right? But priority is really important. It's not as important in business when we're talking about impact. So the thing there is that if we're talking about business or social level impact, the thing is not who gets the idea out first, it's who gets settled on the right business model first. Because ultimately it's business models that win, not a core technology or core idea. So it requires just a slightly different mindset. But I think the point about the time wasting is you just need to think about, again, what are your objectives, right? There are some people for whom publishing papers is fine, and that's all we want to do. We'll just get our grants, we'll write our papers, perfect, right? But if there's something that you want to have happen outside, these are that's when you need to think about this stuff, right? And that's when you can end up with what I was calling wasted time, right? There are a bunch of people that would say, I wrote 10 papers over 4 years. That was great. But yeah, it just depends on what you're trying to aim for.
Are there any other questions?
Yes. Thank you, Kim. It's really good talk and we learn a lot, I guess. And I just wanted to ask you, just adding both of them questions. For the students like non-business field, as like science and humanities,
Yep.
what common challenges do you think when we are trying to commercialize our output and research as a young researcher, where and what kind of common challenges can come which we need to be prepared?
First common challenge for most of you in this room is your advisor, right? Because they might have a very different picture of what good outputs look like. So I always feel a little bit bad about talking to PhD students about this because you can go running out there and say, yes, that's what I'm doing, but that may or may not be something that fits with the research group that you're with. So just having a common shared picture of this is what good work looks like, this is what good impact looks like, that's a really important part, and just building that understanding up. And that can be a really difficult thing to manage when you're the PhD student in that relationship. So that's one challenge. I think the other thing is that the slides that I skipped over talked about the work that I've done with CSIRO. So I've worked with almost 200 now research teams with over 1,000 researchers on those teams. None of them have been based in business. All of them have been based in social sciences, or most of them have been in ecology or physics or like sciences, a lot from IT. So all of this is not specifically for this is what for people in business should be doing. The fact of the matter is business PhD researchers aren't paying that much attention to this probably as any more than anyone in any other field does. So I think part of it is just having that clear picture of what impact do I want to have in the world, right? So the thing I would really keep looping back to is what is it that you're trying to achieve with doing research, right? It can be, saving the Great Barrier Reef, like I said. It can be creating a circular economy. It can be solving cancer, curing cancer, right? There's a whole set of things, but like even Ian Fraser, right? If you ever get a chance to hear him talk, go listen, because they discovered the cure for cervical cancer. They published the paper for it. He then had to basically distract himself from research for 18 years until it became commercialized and it actually started to cure cancer. And if you ask him, was that worth it? He always says, absolutely, because my job was not to cure mice, right? It was to cure people. And so so he was really clear on, this is the impact that I'm trying to have. This is how it all fits together. And I think it's just important to think about that, because it's possible to find yourself in a situation where you're only looking at an internal set of academic metrics relating to the literature. Literature is multiple degrees away from the world, right? And so it's possible to exist over there and to thrive and to have a successful academic career, but if you're only over there, you don't have any impact over here. And so you just need to think about what does that part want? What do I want it to look like for me? So I hope that helps.
Thank you very much, Tim. We're going to wrap up the session here. We have a bit of a break, I think 15 minutes, so hopefully Tim can maybe stick around if that's okay, if there are any other burning questions.
Yep.
Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, for sharing some of the failures as well, and the insights from those. One thing that really stuck with me is conversations are the smallest units of change, and I think that really speaks to the concept of the ARC Industrial Transformation Training Centres, and really indeed any industry placement program, because these programs are what put you in that environment where you can have conversations and you can understand the perspectives of other people and you can understand their needs and you can reflect on what you're doing and how that aligns. So a very important message. Thanks again, Tim. And just as a token of our appreciation, a bit of a CIRES goodie bag full of
Excellent.
CIRES merchandise
Okay,
for you.
thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.